Good morning, Mishna Mavens.
Good
How are
morning.
you?
Morning, John.
Hey,
Yeah,
Dad. Happy birthday. Well,
thank you.
yesterday.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hope it was a good day.
You had a great day.
Good. Um, Hi, everyone. My usual disclaimer, we haven't officially started yet, but we will be recording today's class. Um, Please do what you need to do to feel that you are not broadcasting anything onto the internet that you don't want broadcast. Thank you. Russell, where are you this morning?
I am in the south of France. This is the harbor at Cannes,
Oh,
Nice. And in real life, you are?
Scarsdale.
There you go. Good to see you. Hi, Harriet. So nice to see you. How are you? Good. I know it was Rochelle's birthday yesterday, so. Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah. She was 20 years old.
Oh, no longer a teenager.
That's it. Yeah.
Happy birthday to your granddaughter.
Thank you.
Really good to see everyone. I always assume by your presence here in class that you are safe, healthy, thriving, and wish the same for your loved ones. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This is our penultimate class for a little while. We're meeting again next week on the 27th, in case you didn't have that on your calendars. We did schedule that. It's kind of a makeup date from the class that we had to cancel 2 weeks ago because of the internet outage that both the temple and my house and a lot of your homes experienced. So we study today, we study next week, then we're on a 6-week hiatus through the holidays. So through Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and we'll resume in early October. Never you fear, there'll be a lot more good learning, but your rabbis, cantors, and WRT staff are hard at work creating an experience of the holidays that will be maximally connected, engaging, spiritually uplifting, challenging, all of those things in these extraordinarily unusual circumstances. So thank you for understanding that we're going to be on hiatus from class for a few weeks. Today is Rosh Chodesh Elul. Today is the first day of the Hebrew month of Elul. So I wish you a Chodesh Tov, a good month. Elul is an extraordinarily important time on the Jewish calendar. It is the 6th month numerically, but of course its real significance is that it anticipates Rosh Hashanah. So it's the last month before the new year. Elul is regarded as the time for spiritual introspection, for taking an account of our souls, how we have engaged our inner lives, and also our relationships, both with our loved ones and our world, and of course with our God over the next 4 weeks. To aid you in the direction of the spiritual work that the season invites us to undertake, WRT will be sending out special emails weekly on Mondays. If you're already signed up for the Thursday morning e-blast or electronic newsletter, which actually went out about an hour or so ago, and has Rabbi Reeser's smiling face at the top, then you will automatically receive the Monday morning emails as well, which will contain a video message from a rabbi and a cantor. There are going to be 2 videos a week that you're getting throughout the month of Elul. I recorded this week's, and we're going to rotate around so that you get to see the faces of all of your WRT clergy over the month of Elul. So I provide a little bit of reflection and insight into the meaning of this time of the year on the Jewish calendar. This is all forthcoming next Monday, August 24th. And then our cantorial colleagues are going to be teaching music for the holidays that would be lovely for you to listen to in advance, because you'll hear it again when we broadcast our high holy days on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and you will have already heard and learned some of the melodies so that you can sing along at home. And you'll also get a little bit of a preview of some of the high definition footage that we've captured for the high holy days. We're already filming the holidays, and some of the material is already in production down in Atlanta, where the digital production studio that we're working with is based. Sermons and Torah readings and a lot of the goodies for the high holy days have not yet been filmed, because what sense is there in writing a sermon today when the world is changing every 4 minutes, let alone every 4 weeks? So really looking forward to engaging with you and having you engage with us over the high holy day period of Elul. So once again, Chodesh Tov, a very happy month of Elul to all of us. And I pray that the promise of Elul to be a time of spiritual growth and to be a time of repair, restoration, renewal, and return will be realized in your lives and above all in our hurting country and across the world. So I have an Elul prayer that I've just shared with you, and I really do pray that this is a month of healing instead of a month of continued inflicting of the pain under which we've been living. But
the class next week.
Yeah.
Because he was out.
Yes. I hear someone speaking. Yes, I've confirmed that there is class next week. So join us for Mishna. And if you can't make it, don't worry. I'm recording everything. And Natalie is sending around an email with the recording of the day's class, usually before Shabbat. My friends, though, you won't get any emails if you haven't registered. So I promise we won't spam you, but the best thing you can do is just let Natalie know in the office, drop us a line, place a phone call. We'll pick up a voicemail if we're not sitting in the office. Many of us are not sitting in the office, and we will put you on the list. And if you don't get the Thursday morning e-blast, well, that's on you. You got to get on that right away, because that's the best way to stay in touch with all the things that are in fact happening. I was about to say at Westchester Reform Temple. And we actually do have a couple in-person youth activities that are going to happen in a safe, socially distanced way. We're doing a letter writing program on the temple outdoor grounds to present to our elderly friends and neighbors in the neighborhood through Dorot, the Jewish Elder Outreach Organization, next week. But not a lot of in-person activities happening for our more adult population at the temple in the interest of safety. But we promise to let you know. We do hope that Sukkot might bring us together in person in certain ways and shapes and forms. And, the temple hasn't disappeared. We've just reformatted how we reach you. So I've now admitted a 3.5 minion to our class. So I'd like for us to begin. It's my prerogative to mute you all. It doesn't mean I don't love you. I love you more. I just would like to create a flow for the class so that we can each hear the person who's speaking. When you have a question, raise your hand, either preferably through the digital interface, write a comment in the chat box, or just unmute yourself so that you can be acknowledged. Please join me in a blessing for sacred study. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, la'asok b'divrei Torah. I am grateful, we are grateful, for the opportunity that has been given to us to immerse ourselves in holy words. Here we go. Let me give you just the briefest of kind of connective material to where we were last week so that you know where we're picking up and what I hope to accomplish today. Though the nice thing about studying a text sequentially as we are is that we get as far as we can, we stop, and then we pick it up at our next session. And there's very low pressure. I enjoy teaching in this way. I hope you enjoy learning with me this way. We are studying Mishna Berakhot, the first tractate in the Mishnah, about blessings. And we have spent all of chapter 1, all of chapter 2, and we're going to make some real headway, probably complete chapter 3 and begin chapter 4 today, as we continue to dive into all of the rules, regulations, customs, norms, debates, conversations surrounding the recitation of the Shema and its surrounding blessings in the flow of the liturgy. Liturgy is just a word that means prayers, or specifically a sequence of prayers. And it's one of those words that people in the official religious business use all the time. There's a liturgy for everything in Jewish life. There's a liturgy for the Kol Nidre service, which happens to take a long time. There's a liturgy for Havdalah, which happens to take 5 minutes. There's a liturgy for the Passover Seder in a book called the Haggadah, and there's a liturgy for the Jewish cemetery service and a Jewish wedding service, and on and on and on and on. So a liturgy is just a sequence of prayers. Most of us are now aware, and I've shared this in class, that the daily liturgies are 3, and we're going to learn a little bit about the 3 daily services today. There's Ma'ariv or Arvit, which is the evening service, followed by Shacharit, the morning service, and then the third is Mincha, or the afternoon service. And I've explained to you before that when you are presenting the order of prayer services in Judaism, it's always evening, morning, afternoon, because evening is the beginning of each new day, right? So today is Rosh Chodesh Elul, the new month of Elul, but actually the day began last night at sunset or moonrise. When the new moon appeared last night, or did not appear, it's not visible, but when the new moon comes, it's a new month. That started last night. Rosh Chodesh is actually either a 1 or a 2 day observance. So Rosh Chodesh is being observed last night, today, and tomorrow. But by the time the sun sets tomorrow and it's Shabbat, it will be the 2nd day of Elul. So evening, morning, afternoon, in that sequence. We'll learn more about that. And the Shema is recited at 2 of the 3 prayer services. The Shema and her surrounding blessings are recited when thou liest down and when thou risest up. So there's an evening Shema and there's a morning Shema. And we've covered all of this extensively in class. There is not a Shema at the Mincha, or the afternoon service, because it is not a time when one conventionally lies down or gets up. Unless you're taking an afternoon shluf, that is not in the rabbi's consideration. The Tefillah, the central prayers of the service, which probably were the sequence of prayers that were coalesced and formalized as a liturgy unto itself. Sometimes, we talked about this last week, called the Shemona Esrei, meaning the 18 benedictions, though it is only 7 on Shabbos. The Shemona Esrei, or the 18 daily benedictions, are recited 3 times a day, evening, morning, and afternoon. And they are, for the evening and morning services, preceded by a Shema and her blessings. In the afternoon service, you just get a standalone tefillah with some introductory liturgy and some concluding liturgy, but no Shema. Okay, that gives us enough to dive in. We have been talking about exceptions to reciting the Shema. And you recall that most of our conversation last week centered around a few different categories of people who may, depending on their circumstances, be exempt from reciting Shema. You have the case of certain kinds of laborers, if they're doing something dangerous, like working at the top of a tree, or they are doing something dangerous, like working on a rooftop, or they're just on a construction site. They may be exempt from reciting the Shema, or they can do it where they are, up in the treetop, up on the rooftop, but they have to come down to terra firma in order to recite the tefillah, the 18 benedictions. And we talked about why that may be, because there's a lot of ellipses, as it were, in the text. The text says, here's what you do. It does not often provide why, and it's left to the reader to make an educated or even uneducated conjecture to that effect. We also talked about, at some length, a bridegroom being exempt from saying Shema, at least for a number of days, in order to fulfill his marital obligation to his new bride. So that was really the meat of the conversation, so to speak. And we finally picked up with Mishna chapter 3, verse 1, which moves from wedding night to mourning. Not M-O-R-N-I-N-G, but M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. In other words, somebody you love has died. And if you are a mourner, what are your obligations vis-a-vis the recitation of the statutory prayers? That's where we pick up today. And so I share with you a little bit from my screen, which I, for some reason, don't have here. One moment, please. Okay, I have it up on the screen now, or I will momentarily. Yeah, here we go. So we're looking at Mishnah chapter 3 of Berakhot. Section 1 we looked at last week. We got to this. Just to recap, one whose dead lies before him is exempt from the recital of the Shema and from the Tefillah, which is another word for the Amidah, which is another word for the Shemona Esrei, or the 18 benedictions, and from Tefillin, putting on your Tefillin. The bearers of the bier, in other words, the pallbearers, and their replacements, the people who come in to take their shifts during the period when a body must be accompanied from the moment of death until the moment of burial. Both those in front of the bier and those behind the bier, those needed to carry the bier, are all exempt from reciting the Shema, because these people have a primary obligation to be either mourners or to show traditional respect for the dead. So the obligation to care for the dead and the bereaved seems to override the immediate obligation to recite the Shema. So if you have a funeral, your first obligation is to take care of the dead and the bereaved, and only then are you obligated to recite the liturgy. But those not needed to carry the bier are obligated. In other words, if you're just part of the coterie of people who have come to pay their respects at a funeral, but you're not a primary mourner or a pallbearer, you don't get out of the Shema just because you went to your work associate's funeral that morning, if that would be a modern analogy. Both, however, are exempt from saying the Tefillah. In other words, everybody gets out of saying the Tefillah if there's a funeral that morning. And the reason is simply because the Tefillah, as we discussed last week, is a much longer set of prayers that requires much greater concentration. This is all on the assumption that people don't have a siddur printed in front of them, right? Because this is all from a time where printing was extremely expensive because it was all scribed by hand, and only there'd be very few copies of text for the community, so everything was transmitted orally for most of the people who learned the prayers. And you would learn the prayers from a very early age, from earliest childhood. That's where we left off last week. So I'm going to read Mishna number 2, and then I'll open up for questions, comments, thoughts, and other forms of group engagement. Okay. Again, the Mishnah is written in a very simple, easy form of Hebrew. And I share a little bit of Hebrew not to intimidate, but rather to increase your comfort level with the idea that if you ever wanted to study and learn Hebrew, you could learn it. It's really not that hard. And because some of these words you may even know. So if you're looking here, kavru, they who, sorry, I shouldn't touch the screen. Kavru et hamet v'chazru. Those who have buried the dead, hamet, met is dead, v'chazru, and have returned. So if you've gone to the cemetery, you've done what you need to do, and you've come back. If they have time to begin and finish the Shema before they get to the row, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Bear with me for 1 second. I'm always like hitting things that I shouldn't on Zoom. If they have time to get to the row, they should. Can everyone see it? Did I put it back on screen? Okay, good. They should begin, but if not, they should not begin. Those who stand in the row, those on the inside are exempt, but those on the outside are obligated. So this idea of a row, how many of you, just by a show of hands, and you really can raise your hands and I'll look through the gallery of faces, have been to a funeral where the rabbi asked you at the end of the service to stand in a row for the mourners, where you actually line up 2 parallel lines? Right, there are a number of hands that have gone up, and that's because this is part of Jewish tradition, that the mourners are given the opportunity as they leave the grave to walk through a human aisle of people who have also come to pay their respects, so that as they depart from the presence of their dead, they are surrounded by the love and care of the other mourners and their community of friends and family. So that's kind of just what is meant by the row. It's clear that this custom of standing in a line for the dead existed in very earliest rabbinic history. So when they have buried the dead and they are returning from the grave, if you have time to begin and finish the Shema, and davening even quickly from memory, it's still going to take you 4 or 5 minutes to daven the Shema and all of its surrounding blessings. Before you get to this row of people, you should. But if not, you should not begin. In other words, your primary obligation is still to the rituals and practices associated with Jewish mourning, caring for the bereaved, attending to the dead. Those are mitzvot of the highest order. This is not to say that reciting your prayers is not a mitzvah of the highest order. It's just that in the hierarchy of the way the Mishnah understands your obligations as a Jew, caring for the bereaved, caring for the dead, rise to a certain level of attentiveness above and beyond one's obligation to say the statutory prayers at any given time of day. And as for those who are already standing in the row to pay their respects to the mourners, those on the inside, so if you're facing the people on the inside, you are exempt from saying the Shema. But if you are outside the row or facing the other direction, you're not part of the immediate circle of loved ones who are there to help the mourning family, you can go off into a corner and daven the Shema quickly, and then go back to the Shiva home, wash your hands, pay your respects, share your love for the person and for their loved one who has died. So we're now at a unit. I've spent the first 15 minutes of class just getting us up to speed and moving us forward a little bit. Any questions or comments, thoughts, personal reflections? Because I assume that not only do each of us have a relationship, whether strongly or weakly, with Jewish prayer, certainly all of us have attended Jewish funerals, and we might even be familiar with some of the norms and customs that are being referenced here. So if you have any thoughts, questions, personal experiences to share, I'm going to open up for that kind of commenting. And I've turned off the screen share momentarily. And if not, we'll move forward. Very well. Okay, great. So we move forward. And again, I'm going to we're going to move a little bit quickly through the next several Mishnayot, or small teachings, which are all related. And you'll kind of just get a sense for the logic and the flow of the text, because Mishnah really does adhere to a pretty tight internal logic. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from writing the Shema. Now, why are we talking about women, slaves, and minors? We are talking about them only because we're talking about exemptions for reciting the Shema. So long as we're talking about who is exempt, when, and how, and why, let's talk about women, slaves, and minors are exempt from reciting the Shema and putting on tefillin. But they are obligated to recite the Tefillah, to to follow the custom of mezuzah, which I think doesn't mean doing the nailing of your mezuzah to the doorframe, but rather the custom of kissing or touching the mezuzah when you cross the threshold of a house, either entering or leaving. We'll talk about these. And Birkat Hamazon, the blessing after meals. So in order to understand this passage, you got to know a little bit about the role of women in Jewish life. I'm going to kind of use women as a categorical inclusio, or a metonym, for women, slaves, and minors. So if I say women, I am referring, in fact, to the three similarly regarded categories of individuals that the Mishnah is discussing here: women, slaves, and minors. But the shorthand for that, just so you understand my nomenclature, I'm just going to say women. In Jewish tradition, women are considered exempt from a number of mitzvot and obligated to a number of mitzvot. The baseline position, and I've said this several times already, even if we haven't explicitly talked about the role of women in Jewish life, but this should be refreshing for you rather than giving you new information. The baseline position of the Mishnah is that this is a book by men for men. This is a book by the rabbinical elite, written for a class of yeshiva students, as it were, yeshiva buchers, who are themselves training to be the teachers of the Jewish community in the Mishnaic period, the early rabbinic period, the first centuries of the Common Era. And therefore, the entire point of view of the Mishnah, the entire frame of reference of the Mishnah, the entire intended audience of the Mishnah are men. Women in Jewish life have always, I shouldn't say always, but for most of Jewish history, women have been relegated to a position of lesser authority and prominence in Jewish life. I'm going to try and use descriptive terms or declarative sentence as opposed to opinions or value judgments. We're all welcome to have our own emotional or intellectual response to that. Is it right? Is it not good? What does it mean for how we live Jewish lives today? What should be the role of women in Jewish life now, given what we have experienced as a people throughout history, given the way the world looks today as opposed to 2,000 years ago? We can talk about all of that, but from a simple declarative, let's look at the text and see what it says standpoint, women occupy positions of lesser authority, lower status than do men in early rabbinical society. One could, and I believe should, posit or argue that the Mishnah definitively advances the status of women above the way the Bible describes women. Certain protections, for instance, for women at the hands of their controlling male interest. For a young woman or a girl, that would be her father. If she has no father, generally a brother. For a woman who is of marrying age, and remember we talked about this last week, we're talking about young adolescents who were being married off. You know, as soon as a young woman hits puberty, she's eligible and in fact should be considered for marriage in the eyes of the Mishnah, and of course that would easily be confirmed as a biblical norm. We know that, you know, women were being married off as pubescent girls, men too, and we have to, again, I think, be very careful to reserve 21st century judgment on the mores of first century societal norms that were widespread and certainly not endemic only to Judaism. Women effectively throughout the Hebrew Bible, though there are notable literary exceptions to this, and especially and including in the Mishnaic age, are still little more than chattel. They are movable properties, and they are regarded as such. There is no biblical word for marriage. There is no character in the Hebrew Bible, male or female, who has a wedding. When someone is taken as a wife, generally the word as a wife is excluded in the Hebrew and only appears if it is the preference of the translator. So generally the verb that applies for a biblical marriage, and I'm using that word in quotes because again, the Bible does not talk about marriage. The verb construct is man takes woman. The word is lakach. Abraham took Sarah. The other word that is used is yada or yodea, like Yoda, the Jedi master, which I'm sure is intentional, by the way. It's a word that means to know, but in the carnal or biblical sense. The Adam yada et Chava ishto. And so Adam knew his wife Eve. The act of sexual congress implies ownership, as in property. The husband now has sexually owned or dominated the female partner, and therefore they are bound together. I also tell my teenagers when I'm studying with them that there's no such thing as living in sin in the Bible. If a couple is sleeping together, which is itself a great euphemism, if they're presumably doing a lot more than sleeping together, but if a couple is having sexual relations, the Bible presumes that they are a married couple. It is prima facie evidence, sexual congress is prima facie evidence that you're married. Because again, the Bible doesn't have marriage. The rabbis institute marriage in the Mishnah, not in this Mishnah, but you got to read on for the Mishnah on, for instance, the tractate called Ketubot, which is all about ketubas, or Yevamot, which is all about levirate marriage. What happens when a married woman's husband dies? She becomes obligated to marry or to be married by the husband, the dead husband's brother. There are entire tractates of the Mishnah about how marriage is to be enacted, and marriage was a way of protecting the status of women. But the baseline assumption is that women do not have the kind of agency or authority in society that men do, because they are effectively property under the controlling interest of what I like to call a proximate male. Again, for a young girl, it's her father. Once she is married off, it becomes her husband. That's the norm. There are all sorts of conditions that are set up in case the father dies, the husband dies, the brother dies. What if there are no men in this woman's life? She becomes like Ruth in the book of the Bible, where she has to follow her bereaved mother-in-law Naomi, right? That's the whole book of Ruth, is all about what do you do in the case of a widow who has a daughter-in-law who is also a widow. It's a story all about the journey of women. And that's why I say, despite these norms, the Bible articulates certain, I call them subversive images of women's power. If you look at, for instance, the book of Genesis, women exercise the defining power in the family unit that actually turns the plot lines of all of the great stories of the patriarchs and matriarchs, right? Think about it, right? Abraham and Sarah are unable to conceive. It is Sarah who authorizes the use of the Egyptian handmaid Hagar specifically for the purpose of siring a child who will be imputed to Abraham and Sarah as their own. That's Ishmael. In the story of Rebekah and Isaac with their twins, Jacob and Esau, it is Rebekah who behind the scenes engineers the deception that Jacob will come before Isaac dressed as his brother. His father is going blind. He says, hey, I'm Esau. I've put goatskin. He doesn't say this, but he's put goatskin on his hands so that he feels all hirsute, hairy like his brother. All of that is orchestrated by his mom. Through the kitchen, it's Rebekah, by the way, who also in the Jacob saga helps prepare that bowl of soup that Jacob uses to exchange for the birthright that he steals from Esau. It's a swap. Here's some soup, give me your birthright. I hope these stories are at least jarring, ringing a few distant bells. So women exercise power and authority throughout the Hebrew Bible, which I describe as highly subversive. I think the author of the book of Genesis, or the stories here, was highly sympathetic to the plight of women, and in this subversive way shows how women could exercise authority and power, even though the norms of the biblical society in which they lived formally restricted them from doing so. One last comment, and then this will, I'm sure, prompt your questions. Therefore, by the time you get to the Mishnah, by the time you get to the rabbis, the status of women has been somewhat determined by these biblical norms, but is formalized so that women are given certain authority, but also restricted from taking certain authority. They are given a number of societal protections, but they are also, we would say, at least through the lens of 20 centuries of hindsight, may still be marginalized and subjugated in the early rabbinical society. Women, therefore, when it comes to the fulfillment of the mitzvot, remember the Mishnah speaks in the language of obligation, release from obligation. One is one obligated for this or that mitzvah? We've just been talking about that. If you have a funeral to go to, are you obligated to say the Shema, or are you exempt? So we're still in the kind of dialectic of obligation and exemption. The baseline position is that women are obligated for those mitzvot only that are both positive and time-bound. I'm going to say that again because I recognize I've been talking for a while and I don't want to lose you on a really important concept. Women are obligated in the rabbinic understanding for those mitzvot that are both positive and time-bound. Somebody give me an example, and for this you will need to be brave and unmute yourself. Somebody give me an example of a mitzvah that is positive. In other words, a mitzvah that is a thou shalt as opposed to a thou shalt not. A thou shalt not is a negative mitzvah. A thou shalt is a positive mitzvah. So somebody give me a real life example of a positive mitzvah.
Thou shalt honor your mother and your father.
Beautiful. Excellent. A great mitzvah. It's in the Ten Commandments. It's straight from the Torah, and there's a word for that in Mishnaic lexicography, which is it is deoraita, meaning it derives from the Torah, which means it's like a super mitzvah, as opposed to lighting Hanukkah candles, which is nowhere in the Torah, which is de-rabbanan, deriving from the rabbis. But honor thy father and mother, honor thy mother and father. It's phrased both ways, variously in the Torah. Father before mother in the book of Exodus, mother before father in the book of Leviticus, just FYI. Women and men are obligated to that mitzvah because it is a positive mitzvah, right? Women are not exempt from any mitzvah that is a thou shalt and that is bound I've totally inverted this. So I got off on such a tear that I've already misled all of you. So let me just qualify my words or retract everything I just said. Women are obligated only to those mitzvot that are negative and not time bound. I had it completely, I was thinking it and I just came out syntactically dyslexic. So in other words, a positive mitzvah like honor thy father and mother is incumbent on both men and women because it is not time bound. So we're going to get to this. Give me an example of a time bound mitzvah, a mitzvah that must take place at a certain time.
Light Shabbos candles.
Perfect. This is a great example. Lighting Shabbos candles is a mitzvah that is both positive, thou shalt kindle the lights for Shabbat, and time bound. You have to do it at a certain time. You cannot kindle Shabbat candles on Wednesday evening or at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday. You have to light it at sundown on a Friday. Now that's unfortunately a bad example because it's one of the 3 positive time-bound commandments that women specifically are obligated to fulfill. So give me another one. We're going to come back to the exceptions. Somebody give me another time-bound mitzvah, something you have to do in Jewish life at a specific time in Jewish life.
A
Recite
breath.
the morning Shema.
Recite the morning Shema. Perform a bris for your son. I heard both of those. Excellent. Great examples. A bris is a positive time-bound commandment. Therefore, it is incumbent only on the men. Reciting the morning Shema is positive and time-bound. Therefore, incumbent only on men. Let me show you again the text we're looking at. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt from writing the Shema and putting on tefillin, because you put on tefillin at the same time you say Shema. You put on tefillin for the morning service. But they are obligated for tefillah, mezuzah, and birkat hamazon. The tefillah is not regarded as a time-bound commandment. Even though it is said 3 times a day, it is not linked the way the Shema is to when thou liest down and when thou risest up. There's simply a Jewish norm that you say the tefillah 3 times a day, but you can actually say it at any 3 times of the day. We'll get back to that. Mezuzah. It's a positive commandment, but it's not time-bound, right? Anytime you cross the threshold of a home or a room, kiss and touch the mezuzah, regard the doorposts of your house, which have the Shema printed on a parchment inside of the mezuzah on a little scroll of what's called a klaf. Klaf is the word for scroll in a mezuzah. And birkat hamazon. Even though it is linked to when you eat a meal, mealtime is not time-bound, right? If you have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on white bread at 2:30 in the afternoon, that is a meal. It's on bread, so you have to say motzi before. We'll get to motzi in a couple minutes, by the way. And birkat hamazon, the long blessing of gratitude afterward. Women are obligated for that because it is not time-bound. But any mitzvah that is positive and time-bound. And that's how you have to start thinking about these things. So positive mitzvot that are also time-bound. Waving a lulav, right? Because you have to do that on Sukkot at a particular time of the Sukkot season. Hearing the Megillah read on Purim, positive and time-bound. Performing a bris, whoever said that, I think that was you, Beth, that's a great example. Performing a bris on the 8th day for a boy who was born to a Jewish mother, positive and time-bound. Men are the ones who are obligated to perform the mitzvah. As opposed to, for instance, giving tzedakah. Giving tzedakah is a positive mitzvah. You must give tzedakah according to the Bible. You must leave the corners of your field unharvested. You must give to the poor. But it's not time-bound. Therefore, women and men are equally obligated for tzedakah. And on and on and on it goes. Blessings after meals, you're exempt. So blessings after meals, women are obligated because they are positive but not time-bound. You can do it anytime. And all men and women are obligated to the negative mitzvot. All of the thou shalt nots, women are obligated as are men. Thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. Just because you're a woman doesn't mean you can say, yeah, I don't really have to worry about thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not move a neighbor's landmark to commit real estate fraud, thou shalt not defraud thy neighbor. You know, all of the things that the Torah and the rabbinic community said about the thou shalt nots, women and men are equally obligated. There's some comments. So let's look in the chat box. Howard and Howard Whites, are you with us? Or is it Frida? You commented, you said, quote, Ruth had to go with her mother-in-law. Please explain had to. Okay, she did not have to. And what makes Ruth special, in fact, is, and thank you for allowing me to clarify and correct myself, Ruth chose to go with her mother-in-law. The story of Ruth, which is a biblical story, it's a whole book of the Bible, it's a small book, it's 4 chapters, is that there's this poor, unfortunate woman named Nomi. She is widowed, and she has daughters. They too are widowed, and her she has sons. They die, so she's bereaved of her husband and her sons, and she has a daughter-in-law named Ruth. And Ruth is interesting because she is not Jewish. She's a Moabite. She's not an Israelite. But Ruth is singular in the Jewish tradition because she says, wheresoever thou goest, I shall go. I talk biblical, just so you know I'm quoting the Bible. I don't really like these translations, but wheresoever thou goest, I shall go. Wherever thou lodgest, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. That's the famous declaration of Ruth. This is why the rabbis view Ruth from their perspective of centuries later as the paradigmatic convert to Judaism. When a person converts to Judaism, the Talmudic laws and norms that are stipulated around conversion all are derived from the book of Ruth, and specifically from Ruth's declaration. So you're right. It's not that she had to go with her mother-in-law, but it's that she chose to. Fasting on Yom Kippur, is that a mitzvah? Excellent. Yes, fasting on Yom Kippur is considered a mitzvah incumbent on the entire Jewish community, both women and men. And I need to figure out why, because that's a positive, and I would think time-bound commandment. But usually the way in which the rabbis get around this is by saying, well, it's not really time-bound. It's not that fasting on Yom Kippur is not a positive commandment. It is. It's that I think the rabbis are going to say, no, it applies for the whole day, and therefore it's not specifically time-bound. Somebody should Google this. Just Google, why are women obligated to fast on Yom Kippur? And I'll bet you that Rabbi Google will have the answer. This is a good stump the rabbi moment, and you've already stumped me. When did the Jewish lineage of a child come through the mother? Excellent question, Barbara. And I see a couple of other hands, and I'll acknowledge you momentarily. This is a rabbinic innovation, right? According to the Hebrew Bible, we don't have matrilineal descent. We have patrilineal descent. A child is presumed to be an Israelite, or we would say a Jew, by reason of paternal parentage, not through the mother, right? A case in point. Moses marries a Midianite woman, that is to say, non-Israelite. They have 2 sons, Gershom and Eliezer, in the Midianite wilderness before Moses reaches the burning bush. He has 2 boys. There is never a question in the mind of the authors of the Bible that Moses' own kids are not Jewish. But if you think that the rabbinic model applies, that the rabbinic norm applies, that it is matrilineally determined, then you should conclude that even Moses' own sons are not Jewish. It doesn't work that way in the Bible. But the rabbis established a different norm. They established a matrilineal norm for Jewish life, which has held sway up until the present day, except for the decision of the Reform Jewish community in 1983 to accept patrilineal descent under certain conditions only in the United States of America. Even the Reform movement in Canada does not accept patrilineal descent. The Reform movement in Israel does not accept patrilineal descent. But the Reform movement in America since 1983, so for the last 37 years, has formally accepted a patrilineal standard of Jewishness under certain other conditions. We can talk about those if and when we want to and have time. But the rabbis established a matrilineal norm. Most kind of like sociological scholars or scholars of Judaism from a phenomenological standpoint, like what is Judaism? Why does it manifest this way? Have conjectured that the reason for a matrilineal standard is that it is the only way to, it is universally reliable in terms of establishing parentage. Up until DNA testing for paternity, there was no way to establish with absolute certainty who the father of a child is or may be. It is always known who the mother is. Right? I mean, let's not get into IVF and test tube babies and all the things that can happen in 2020. But for most of Jewish history, you could definitively say, I know who the mother is because she was there when the child was born. You didn't always know who the daddy is. And therefore, a matrilineal standard makes much more sense if you want to establish without controversy the Jewish status of any given child. Michelle, let me acknowledge your hand, and then my dad, you're next.
Thanks. I have two thoughts. Probably a total of two thoughts, but the first is just to take a half step back of this whole structure of the mitzvot and when you have to do them and who has to do them tells a lot about Judaism, not just about the role of women, slaves, and minors, but in fact that it is very obsessed right from the get-go with specific actions and doing them right, correctly, which I think is a broader issue. And that's where we get and it's part of the whole, a mitzvah is a requirement as opposed to a nice thing to do, or if you're not required of it, you get extra credit for doing it, which is not the case.
That's right. The way in which we
Which
learn
is very hard for our brains to get around.
We were also taught wrong. 95% of the people on this Zoom this morning, if not more, myself very much included, were taught at a very young age that a mitzvah is a good deed, and a good deed is called a mitzvah. And the two become very much interchangeable. And I can understand why that has been the case, though I think that might be an American norm, that it's more compelling for Americans to speak in the language of individual choice. But Judaism is not a particularly individual choice-oriented religion, at least not in its classical framework. That's an innovation of post-Enlightenment Judaism, Reform Judaism in particular, to affirm the role of individual autonomous choice. But the norms of Jewish life are established in the language, as you've said, of thou shalt and thou shalt nots, of obligation. So a mitzvah literally means a commandment, and that's the way we should understand it. To frame a mitzvah as a good deed, I think actually is not just a semantic, subtle difference, but is rather a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Mishnah means when it speaks in the language of mitzvot. So I think you're absolutely right, Michelle. It's a very, very important point for us to consider. Dad.
When it comes to positive obligations versus negative and fasting, it seems to me that it could be a negative in the sense that thou shalt not eat, thereby obligating women.
I wondered about that myself. I thought about it as I was reflecting on the stumper from this morning, which I love that you've given me. So if nobody finds out before the end of class, I promise to make it my homework. If you think of the fasting obligation not as a positive time-bound mitzvah, but rather as a negative time-bound mitzvah, for these 24 or 25 hours, thou shalt not eat, drink, engage in sexual congress, bathe, anoint thyself, or wear leather shoes. In other words, what makes Yom Kippur are the same 5 things that make Tisha B'Av. It is a 5-fold abstention, not a 5-fold obligation. And I think that may be and I thought about that. So good job, Dad. You think like a rabbi. I appreciate it.
I
won't get into the whole chicken egg thing. I'd like to believe that we mutually reinforce each other's thinking, but that's really nice to hear. It's a great way of thinking through it, and I will make it my business to solve this one definitively, not later than next week's class. Okay, so this has been a little bit on the status of women in Jewish life, and of course what I haven't said is that for men, all of these positive time-bound mitzvot from which women are exempt are incumbent upon men. For men, these are obligations. There are, as I think it was Linda Markowitz helped me tee up a thought that I wanted to make sure to return to, which is that there are 3 exceptions. There are 3 times when women in Jewish life are, in fact, obligated to positive, time-bound mitzvot. So, Linda, remind us what's one of them, because you said it. Oh, you got to unmute.
Light the Shabbos candles.
Light the Shabbos candles. And the Mishnah in Mishna Shabbat, which is the very next Mishnah, I think. I got to go back and look. I think after Brachot, we do Shabbat. Mishnah Shabbat stipulates that women are obligated to 3 mitzvot. They all take place on Erev Shabbos. The first one is light the candles. So that is specifically incumbent on women. The conjecture I think here is that women are presumed to be in charge of the domestic domain, right? Everything else, the world of commerce, the world of prayer, the world of agriculture, all of that is the domain of men, according to the Mishnah. But the home is actually, the woman reigns supreme. She is the chief authority, and therefore convening the family and declaring the beginning of Shabbat in 3 ritual ways, through the lighting of candles is the first, is incumbent on the woman and not on the husband. These gender norms may, for many of us in our Reformed Jewish community in Scarsdale in 2020, feel or even be outmoded. But again, I phrase this simply so that you are aware of the tradition, because if you want to evaluate whether or not a particular Jewish norm, whether a restriction or an obligation, is relevant today, I don't think you can make that evaluation without knowing its history. What are the other 2? These are trickier. Lighting the Shabbos candles is an easy. That's a gimme. Does anyone know one or both of the other 2? And I've given you a big clue already. They both have to do with the onset of Shabbat. So what are the 2 other things that a woman is responsible for arranging before Shabbat begins?
Mikvah.
As Shabbat begins.
You're supposed to throw that piece. Oh, sorry.
So mikvah, actually, no. Mikvah is a positive time-bound commandment, positive but not time-bound commandment. Therefore, women are in fact obligated to go to the mikvah, but there's not a time, in other words, on the calendar or a clock time when you have to go to the mikvah. You have to go to the mikvah if you've experienced menstruation or if you're ritually impure, but that is not the same as time-bound. Time-bound means there's a date on the calendar and a time on the clock. So mikvah, great educated guess, not one of the 3 things. And mikvah wouldn't necessarily be related to Shabbat, but of course, if you are in a state of menstrual impurity, we're going to get to this today, by the way, you would have to go to the mikvah before you can enter the holiness of Shabbos, but it's not time-bound. So it's not one of the 3 things that is the exception to the rule. Joanne put it in the chat box, so she gets a bonus point for challah. Women are responsible for challah. This does not primarily refer to the baking of delicious braided egg bread. Challah is a biblical term that means the dough offering. The dough offering. When you bake your Shabbos challahs, which are supposed to be 2 of them, in remembrance of the way in which when Shabbat came, God provided the Israelites with a double portion of manna to get them through the weekend, because you're not allowed to go out collecting food on Shabbat. So the manna would drop from the sky and the Israelites would go collect it every morning. And that's how it went 6 days of the week. But on Shabbos, on Fridays, you'd get a double portion of manna to carry you through Saturday, and you wouldn't collect again until Sunday. That's the biblical legend that goes with this. But the custom that comes out of that is that you're supposed to have 2 challahs on a Friday night, which always seems terribly wasteful unless you have a lot of people over for dinner. But if you go to any traditional Jewish home, an Orthodox Jewish home will always have double challahs. Lechem Mishna, literally double portion of bread. When you bake a challah, you are supposed to remove a chunk of the dough and cook it to really burn it up in the oven as a dough offering. The Bible stipulates this. The rabbis affirm this commandment. It is a positive, time-bound mitzvah incumbent on the woman who was the baker for the home. Has anyone here ever done the mitzvah of challah? Joanne, you're like our chief WRT challah baker. Have you ever taken challah? Have you ever done the challah custom?
I've removed a piece of dough, not necessarily burned it in my oven.
Okay, thank you. Have any of you ever seen a funny little line on your box of Passover matzah that says, challah is taken? It's on every box of kosher for Passover matzah. Challah is taken. What the hell? So here's what that means. It means that this is legitimate challah matzah that can be used for sanctifying the night of Pesach or Shabbos. I mean, but the point is that it's bread from which the sacrificial dough offering has already been removed, burned according to Jewish law, and now can be presented not just as something, that will fill your belly, but will be used to sanctify Jewish time, right? So we got two of them. Light the candles, take the challah. The third one is really hard to just guess. It is, have you established the eruv? Have you set the boundary over which you as a household or as an individual may not cross on Shabbat? If there already is an eruv for your community, you don't have to do much. You just have to check that it's still there. An eruv is a thread or a cord that literally, physically defines the boundary of a Jewish community. And when we get to Mishna Shabbat down the road, when we keep our study up, you'll see that one of the chief obligations on Shabbat or restrictions on Shabbat, and again, now I'm not sure if this is a positive or a negative mitzvah, is the mitzvah that you have to have an eruv, or is the mitzvah thou shalt not cross over the boundary? I'm going to have to look into that. I think that an eruv is considered a positive commandment. You must establish a boundary, parenthesis, over which one may not cross. You're not allowed to cross between the private domain and the public domain on Shabbat. That's a conundrum for Jewish communities, because that would logically imply that you can't leave your home on Shabbat. But of course, you got to get to shul to pray. You got to get somewhere to daven. So what Jewish communities do is they've come up with a halachic loophole. This is in the Mishnah. The Mishnah invented this. The Mishnah says, well, we know that one of the things you can't do on Shabbat is commerce. Therefore, in order to restrict commerce, we will make it impossible for Jews to cross from a private domain like the home to a public domain like the marketplace or the street, the public square. But you still have to get to shul. So you make what's called an eruv, a physical boundary, a cord that's usually strung across telephone poles that defines the perimeter and the limits over which you shall not cross in order to fulfill your Shabbos obligations. So shuls are always within the eruv. And of course, the famous story locally that Rabbi Jacobs loved to share with our congregation pertained to the establishment of the local eruv for the Orthodox community of Scarsdale, which includes parts of New Rochelle, because Young Israel of Scarsdale is actually in New Rochelle. Most of the Orthodox community in our neighborhood actually lives in New Rochelle because they don't need to take advantage of the stellar Scarsdale schools because they send their kids to day school. Like, this is, I'm off on a tangent here, but this is real life Judaism. When Rabbi Jacob Rubenstein of blessed memory, he and his wife, Deborah Zichrona Livracha, both perished in that terrible, terrible house fire about 12 or 13 years ago. It was just awful. A lightning bolt struck their house. It ignited their boiler, their oil tank, and the house went up overnight on Barad, I think it was. I think they lived in Scarsdale or New Rochelle. But Rabbi Jacobs enjoyed a very close collegial relationship with Rabbi Rubenstein Zichrono Livracha. And when the eruv was being established, Rubenstein deliberately had the eruv. He lobbied his community to have the eruv include Westchester Reform Temple, so that if there were a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah at WRT on a Shabbos morning, and one of his parishioners, one of his congregants wanted to go daven at WRT, it would be halachically permissible to do so. That is an extraordinary thing, by the way, in the 1980s or 1990s this must have been, for an Orthodox rabbi to have done. of any stripe. I mean, yes, modern Orthodox, but it's really, it set the template for achdut, the Jewish word that comes from echad, that means unity or collaboration, that persists to this day between me and my good friend Rabbi Jonathan Morgenstern, who was his successor. At the time, Jonathan Morgenstern was a 28-year-old assistant rabbi when his senior rabbi and Rebbitzin were killed. So I deeply love and respect my colleague in that community because they have continued to lift up as a primary value Klal Yisrael, the unity of the Jewish people, so that a restriction like Eruv should not exclude the Reform Jewish community just because we're Reform and don't adhere to the same halachic norms that they do. It's quite a good story, isn't it? I'm grateful to be able to share it with you this morning. Setting up the Eruv or establishing the validity, the kashrut, the kosher status of the Eruv is incumbent on the woman. Why? Because again, it affirms the woman's authority in the domestic domain. It's actually up to the woman to determine what is a home and what is public. What is your space and what is public space. So it is the woman's obligation, light Shabbat candles, take challah in the ritual sense, and establish the Eruv. And when we get to Mishna Shabbat, you'll see there's one line, but you're going to laugh at this, or maybe you'll roll your eyes. The way the Mishnah puts the phrase is that it is incumbent upon a man to say to his wife right before Shabbos the following statement: Isartem, Eravtem, Hadliku et haner. Isartem, have you taken the tithe, which means have you taken the challah tithe, the dough offering? And she's supposed to be able to say, yes, of course, husband, I have. Eravtem, have you checked the Eruv? Have you established the Eruv? Eravtem. Eruv, from the same word as Erev, meaning evening, which is also a boundary between day and night. See, Hebrew's awesome. Eravtem. And by the way, the word Erev also means mixed up. Things that are neither this nor that are Eruv. When a mixed multitude goes out of Egypt, the Bible uses the language of an Erev Rav, a great mixed multitude, an Erev. So Erev means a boundary or something that delineates between this and that, day and night. It's pretty cool. Okay, Isartem, have you taken the tithe? Eravtem, have you set up the Eruv? And finally, Hadliku et haner, light the candles, woman. So, the reason I said you would either chuckle or roll your eyes is that even the 3 time-bound positive mitzvot that are incumbent on women are phrased as it's the obligation of the man to nag his wife. That's the way the Mishnah actually puts it. And that, my friends, has been a 45-minute excursus on the role of women in the Mishnaic period. I hope you enjoyed it. It will enable us to move on and have a lot of knowledge for continuing the conversation. Somebody wrote a comment in the chat box about menstrual impurity with a question mark. Let's just use that question in the chat box as an invitation to keep reading because that actually is going to come up. Here's where we really get into the weeds. But so long as we're talking about women, you got to sometimes intuit the logic of the Mishnah. I've told you that the book is logical, but it follows its own logic. It's almost free associative in a way. Here we are talking about women. So while we're talking about women, let's talk about ejaculating. So that's the Mishnaic mind at work. Remember, this is a book by men for teenage boys. Think about that. It's a book by rabbis for teenage boys or young adolescent boys who are preparing to become men and specifically to become rabbis, teachers, and leaders of the community. So you got to talk about something that every young man needs to get very familiar with, which are emission of semen. I love the way in which the Mishnah uses lots of cool euphemisms to talk. So a person who has a seminal emission, see that right here? In Hebrew, Baal Keri. Baal is a person who owns or is the master of something. Baal is a Hebrew word that means husband. Yes, it is also the name of the chief Canaanite deity, Baal, which means the master, but it can also just denote ownership. Let me give you an example. What is the ritual name for a person who is called up to read the Torah? Somebody might have chatted it. No, we're not there yet.
Baal Koreh.
Right, Baal Koreh, literally a master of reading. Baal Koreh, or some more, I think more idiomatically, the reader, the one who handles the reading. Baal Koreh. Who is the person who blows the shofar on the high holidays? He, presumably he, because it's a positive time-bound mitzvah, is a Baal Tekiah, a master of the blast, master blaster. So Baal Keri in this passage literally means a person of the event, a master of the event, or as Jerry Seinfeld or might have said, master of one's own domain, right? But in this case, actually quite the opposite. If you know that episode of Seinfeld to which I am referring, a master of one's own domain is one who could actually keep his hands to himself while single and remain not only celibate, but also hands-off. A Baal Keri is a person to whom the thing happens to him. Okay, it is a euphemism. The same way last week it talked about sexual intercourse between a bridegroom and a bride as lasot maaseh, to do the deed. Okay, that's a euphemism. Here's one, Baal Keri, a person who has the thing. Meharher belibo ve'eno mevarech. He should mumble, meharher. I love this word. He should contemplate. He should think on the words of the Shema in his heart, belibo, in his lev, ve'eno mevarech, but not bless. Mivarech like mivorach, like baruch. See baruch right here in the word? Bet, resh, chaf. Mivarech. So if you have had a seminal emission, and that's any kind, by the way, that's through intercourse, it's also through a nocturnal emission. It's also presumably through masturbation, though masturbation is restricted in the rabbinic understanding, so we're not really talking about that. But if you ejaculate, then you probably shouldn't be saying the Shema out loud because you are ritually impure. And semen is not the only fluid that makes a person ritually impure. Menstruation also makes a person impure. Coming into contact with a corpse also makes a person ritually impure. Snot and tears and urine do not necessarily make a person ritually impure, but vomit and feces do. So yeah, I know this is like your rabbi is talking this way, but again, I'm trying to just speak in very simple declarative sentences. And I hope you'll gather from this that the Mishnah believes that Jewish life is about a whole lot more than what happens in shul. That's something I tell my teenage students all the time. Judaism is not the thing you do when you come to Westchester Reform Temple. Judaism is the thing you do from the moment you go to sleep to the moment you go to sleep. Every day. And the Mishnah provides this comprehensive framework so that, whoa, and I love showing passages like this to my teenage students. They can handle it. They've had sex ed. Like, why are the rabbis so obsessed with semen and menstruation? And I'm like, because it's life, man. This is the stuff of life, and it's messy, and it's bodily fluids, and it's also holiness, and it's also prayer, and it's also tzedakah, but it is also semen and menstruation. That's the stuff of life, is it not? Right? These are the fluids that produce life and that indicate fertility. So this is really important for the rabbis. These are not gross or desanctified. These actually are the stuff of sanctity. I love Judaism for that. I think Judaism is incredible. It says, we can talk about sanctity, but sanctity isn't something you do in a monastery hermetically sealed off from the rest of society. Sanctity pertains to relations between husbands and wives. Sanctity pertains to how you treat your body and how your body does what it's supposed to do, and sometimes how you remedy things when your body's not doing what it's supposed to do. In any case, if you have ejaculated, you just whisper Shema to yourself. You don't say it out loud. And I think that there's some interesting things that are implied there. And I'd be curious just to see how do you parse that line? Like, what are the assumptions that underlie why you shouldn't be saying the Shema if you've just had an ejaculation of semen?
I posed a kind of side question to you in the chat box.
Yeah, go ahead and share the question out loud. I saw it, and I'm not sure I have an answer, but I think the question itself is illuminating.
there is the character of Lilith, who is said to be Adam's first wife, but is a demonic figure who was said to steal the semen from ejaculations from seminal emissions and use them to make demon children. So I'm wondering if somewhere the rabbis got the notion that maybe a Shema would be in order.
I love that. Maybe, but probably more to the point, it's less that a Shema would be in order, and it's more that if you are ejaculating, if you've emitted semen, you are in a state of ritual impurity, and before you can do any of the prayer stuff, you got to get yourself to a mikveh. Where exactly Lilith fits into all of this, Lilith is a midrashic figure, so she is also a character, a creation of the rabbinic imagination. And I think that perhaps it points to, just more broadly, a rabbinic obsession with sex, sexuality, Jewish norms. There's a lot of, Lilith resides in the kind of murkier world of folklore, which is why she doesn't make it into the Mishnah, because she's not part of the building blocks of Jewish life. But the rabbis have an incredible imagination. One of my favorite books from my first year of rabbinical school, I found it in the library of HUC in Jerusalem. I was looking for a different book, and I saw this book, and I'm like, this book gave me such a chuckle. It's called Rabbinic Fantasies. I'm like, well, boy, this sounds tittillating. It's boring as hell. But that's where it's books like that. It was a collection of midrash, and clearly, like, I could just see the publisher saying to the rabbi who compiled this book, it's like, we're never going to sell any copies if you call this an exploration of midrash. Let's call it Rabbinic Fantasies and see who buys it. But anyway, so I would say that Lilith resides in the realm of rabbinic fantasies. She's kind of this flight of rabbinic fancy. But here's the connecting point. The rabbis of the Mishnah and the imaginative rabbis who give us the Lilith tradition both have this kind of hang up around particularly ejaculate. And why exactly, I don't know, but sex has all sorts of strange customs, both normative and I would call them occult, in every religion and every spiritual mode throughout human history. All sorts of occult practices derive around the act of sex. End thoughts. Okay, so it's just, I'm kind of just riffing here, but that would be how I would walk through that question. Barbara, I see your hand.
Yeah, okay, sorry. A man isn't allowed to spill a seed.
Well, unless he is doing it for the purpose of procreation, or if it just happens on its own. A man is not allowed to, according to the rabbinic understanding, masturbation is sometimes called onanism. That's an actual word in the English dictionary, derived from the biblical character in Genesis chapter 38 of Onan, one of the sons-in-law of Judah, the same Judah who was born to Jacob, who is one of the older brothers of Joseph. Judah has an issue with successfully marrying off his daughters. Basically, his first daughter gets married. That husband was evil and God caused him to die. Second husband, he got wise, and he I think was afraid of mating with her, so he would spill his seed on the ground before doing the deed, and God didn't like that either and killed him.
It was Judah's sons, not his daughter, because
thank you.
Ended up
his sons. Thank you. Yes. Tamar is his daughter-in-law. Yes, of course. The story wouldn't play out very well if it was his actual daughter. Thank you, Michelle, for the correction. So Judah's sons, I didn't come prepared to talk about Onan today, but if I had done my homework, of course, I would have gotten exactly what you just said. So look, from this, the rabbis derive a kind of wide-ranging restriction on masturbation, which later rabbis actually have challenged, interestingly, and particularly with the insights of psychology about the possible sexual health benefits of masturbation. And of course, in a world where we're not marrying off our young men and women at the age of 12, 13, or 14, and young people are sexually active well into their 20s or even 30s before they get married these days, there are plenty of rabbis who believe that the restriction on masturbation is ill-advised and not particularly well attuned to other Jewish norms. of life. But anyway, the real issue with Onan is that he refused to have productive intercourse with his wife, but rather was spilling his seed on the ground because he didn't want to do the mitzvah to which he was obligated. He was specific. The issue wasn't masturbation. The issue was that he was refusing to do be fruitful and multiply, right? And that's a very different, and I think that a lot of the restrictions on masturbation have been misinterpretations or over-interpretations of what Onan did that was so bad, and why the Bible does not smile on his behavior. I believe it's because he was exploiting his wife as a sex object without doing the procreative deed that he was obligated to do. Long story. It also bespeaks the rabbinic hang-ups and obsessions with sex. Okay. Couple other chat comments. The term for Jews who convert to more orthodox practice are Baalei Tshuva. Yeah, exactly. A Baal Tshuva is a master of return. Same root as Baal Koreh, Baal Tekiah. Here's a good one, by the way. The Mishnah will later describe if a boy is born with a very fleshy foreskin, which becomes a problem for the moil, right? If it's really, really hard to circumcise the child is referred to as a Baal Basar, literally an owner of flesh, or a master of, or even more crassly, a master of meat. He's just got a really meaty foreskin, like a meaty penis that's hard to circumcise. Okay. Somebody else wrote, is this biblical QAnon? Yeah, maybe so, but I'm not going to go there. Okay. Here we are. We've got a little bit more Mishnah. We've got about 20 minutes to go. We won't get as far today, and that is just fine with me. Oops, not what I wanted to share. My apologies. Our text is over here, nice and big. Share screen. So the rest of that Mishnah, we're going to go straight from emission of semen to mealtime, which is, I admit, unappetizing. But remember, the rabbis are still talking in the language of obligation and exemption. So that's the connecting thread. And again, to a casual reader, to a person who's not accustomed to reading Mishnah, not accustomed to rabbinic writing, it sometimes seems very willy-nilly, non sequitur city, right? What the hell does this have to do with that? Just look at the larger flow here. We're still, the bigger category is exemption and obligation for reciting your statutory prayers. What are the categories of exemption? If you have had an emission of semen, whether through intercourse or nocturnal emission, which is of course permitted because you had no choice in the matter, it's not volition. You weren't trying to have a nocturnal emission. You got to go to the mikveh before you can say your Shema. But you don't say a blessing neither before nor after, meaning the surrounding blessings for the Shema. You just whisper Shema Yisrael and Ve'ahavta and the following paragraphs and you're good to go. Over food, and again, this is still the condition of a person who's had an emission of semen, one would say a blessing afterward, but not the blessing before. But this is disputed by Rabbi Judah, who says, no, you say the motzi before you eat, and you say Birkat Hamazon, and the fact that you've just had an ejaculation has nothing to do with it. It's still an obligation. You're about to enjoy food. Get over yourself. So the rabbis are not of a uniform opinion on how restricted a person who has not yet been to the mikveh following an ejaculation must be before reciting prayers associated with mealtime. Okay. There are things, if you're really Jewish, there are things you're going to have to think about that you've never thought about before. Moving on. If a man, oh, we're still on the same subject. Now we've moved on from the Shema to the Tefillah, from the Shema and her surrounding blessings to the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei. If a man was saying the Tefillah and he remembers that he is one who has had a seminal emission, okay, so it's 6:30 in the morning. You got up, and in the middle of the night, let's say you had a nocturnal emission, or let's say you had sex and you did not purify yourself at a mikveh between the act and the morning prayers. That's a very plausible scenario, by the way. But let's say you're mid-Shema, it's now 6:30, you finish the Shema, and you're into the Tefillah, you're into the biggest prayer of the morning, and all of a sudden you remember, oh shoot, I had sex last night, or I had a nocturnal emission last night. He should not stop. Don't just stop your prayers, finish your prayers, but he should abbreviate the blessings. If he went down to immerse, so if you did have a nocturnal emission or had sex, you ejaculated, You did go down to the mikveh, you immersed yourself in the mikveh. If you have the time to come up from the mikveh and cover himself, in other words, get dressed, or put a towel on or a robe, and still recite the Shema before sunrise, go do that. Okay, that would be the optimal scenario. But if not, if you did not have time to go to the mikveh and put on your clothes and get to your morning Shema all before sunrise, here's what you should do. You should cover yourself with the water of the mikveh and recite your Shema then and there. You know, you've done enough of ritual purification that you can now say the Shema. However, not stinky water. You should not cover yourself either with foul water or with steeping water. Steeping water is the water that would be used to soften flax and would become very unpleasantly fragranced by softening flax. So that's specifically what's being referred to here. Until you pour fresh water into it, presumably enough to dilute it from the nasty aroma. How far should you remove yourself from it and from excrement? 4 cubits. All I want to point out here is that we're talking about a world before modern plumbing. And I think that it may turn our stomachs a little bit to think about all these things. And it's really interesting, the interplay between bodily fluids and all of this other nasty stuff that the Mishna is talking about. It's clearly trying to create a boundary between that which is sacred and that which is profane, that which is godly and that which is earthbound, right? That which is elevated, your act of prayer, and that which is flesh and stink and fluid and semen and poop and all of this stuff. And the rabbis are observe that at least in the ancient world, all this stuff was bluched up together, right? You can't get away from the fact that in a world without modern plumbing, you are just always encountering nasty stuff. You don't have the benefits of modern sanitation. So how do you create both the physical space and the time to do the holy stuff? Well, I think the rabbis are saying in this Mishnah, you do your best. You try your best to create boundaries. You can't create an eruv between the place where you go to the bathroom and the place where you pray, but you can do your best to create some kind of separation in space. 4 cubits, that's about 6 feet distance, if that's a meaningful distance. I think we've all become very accustomed to what 6 feet looks like these days. Cubit is about 1.5 feet. It's the distance from an average male's fingertip to his elbow. So approximately 1.5 feet of distance times 4, that's 6 feet. So you got to keep a 6 foot distance. And as we all know, 6 feet is exactly the distance you need not to be contaminated. This is real. I saw this when I was preparing today's Mishnah. I didn't study onan and masturbation, but I did study cubits. And I was thinking to myself, oh my God, it's a 6 foot distance. It's social distancing, right? So in the case of excrement or all this other nasty stuff, you need to create a 6 foot perimeter, a 6 foot radius, so that you are at least far enough away that it's not going to contaminate your act of prayer. And this isn't about germ theory, right? This is just about your proximity to all the yuck needs to be both acknowledged and addressed in order to create both the time and the space for holiness. Okay, so we have some comments in the chat box. Some of these are public, some of these are private. With regard to the mikveh, you are supposed to be cleaned up before you immerse. Yeah, you don't go into a mikveh filthy. But in the case of a nocturnal emission or sex, I mean, presumably you've washed yourself, you've done your ablution, and then you go to the mikveh for ritual purification. The mikveh is not the same as a bathtub. It's not a shower. It's ritual purification. Sex, Dottie wrote, Dottie Levin, hi Dottie. Sex and the other Yom Kippur abstentions are those of people sitting Shiva as well, correct. Shiva, or I should say the Yom Kippur, well, except you don't fast during Shiva. In fact, you shouldn't fast. You should eat lots of tuna sandwiches. But you're not supposed to have sex. You're not supposed to anoint yourself. You're not supposed to bathe or shave during Shiva. And it's less about Shiva and it's more about Yom Kippur. That is to say, Yom Kippur is a day where we reenact our own death, right? We dress in white, the same as the shrouds for the dead. We do not take in anything that nourishes the body, neither food nor water. We humble ourselves. Larry Hoffman says we beat our chests as if we're trying to resuscitate a dead body. It's really quite amazing. We stare at an open ark, the word for which is the same as the Hebrew word for a coffin, removed of its Torahs on Kol Nidre, as if we are confronting our own mortality. So a lot of the imagery and liturgy for Yom Kippur evokes a confrontation with death, or invokes a confrontation with death. And therefore, if Shiva reminds you of Yom Kippur, I would say that is intentional. Somebody privately chatted me and asked, why do rabbis view sex as making you dirty when it is his obligation to procreate? So that's a really good question. And I would say that you have to be careful around dirty. In the Jewish tradition, I don't think there's anything that would substantiate what I view as more of a Christian norm that sex is dirty. However, the fluids that are produced in sexual congress or in simply signaling human fertility, be it menstrual blood or menstruation, semen, placenta, the afterbirth, all of these things go all the way back to the book of Leviticus, where they actually confer upon the person who experiences them, either male or female, a state of ritual impurity. It's not dirt and it's not dirty. It's the Hebrew, the whole book of Leviticus is framed around two modes. There's tameh, which means impure, and tahur, which means pure. Don't confuse these with good and bad, dirty and clean. They're simply two ways of being. And Leviticus in particular is a book that abhors ambiguity. Leviticus, from an anthropological study perspective, and the great sociologist Mary Douglas wrote a book in the 1960s, a seminal book, no pun intended, or maybe pun intended, called Purity and Danger, where she explores taboo in various societies across civilization, particularly ancient societies, and how societies develop taboos as a way of reconciling human discomfort with the chaos that is inflicted by ambiguity. Let me give you an example, because that was pretty highfalutin language. What is a shrimp? It dwells in the sea. It swims along all the other fishes, but it doesn't have fins. So what is this thing? It's neither a fish. Is it a bug? Not really, because it doesn't have all the creepy crawly bug features. I don't know what to do with this shrimp. I'm going to make sure that we don't eat it. Shrimp, bad. Not bad, but shrimp is taboo. Why? Because it's ambiguous, right? It's neither here nor there. And even if the categories or criteria by which non-ambiguity can be established seem somewhat arbitrary to us, okay, what makes an animal permissible to eat if it is a land-dwelling animal?
It has to be a ruminant and have a cloven hoof.
Got to chew its cud, has to have a ruminant stomach or be a ruminant mammal. It digests in stages and chambers, and it has to have cloven hooves. Mm-hmm. That's what defines normal for land-dwelling animals that you might want to have for dinner. That's arbitrary, right? But it gives the rabbis a playbook. It gives them something to work off of. Okay, so you don't have to ask, well, how do I know? Can I eat a horse? No, you cannot. Cloven hoof, non-ruminant. Can I eat a pig? Cloven hoof, non-ruminant. Can I eat a cow? Go for it. It's both a ruminant, has a cloven hoof. Sheep, goat, all okay. Deer, also fine. Venison is kosher. The only problem is you can't really get venison that is being farm raised, because deer are not domesticated the way cattle are. And the issue with eating venison is that there's no slaughterhouse for deer, right? The only way to get a deer is to go out and kill it. And that's not kosher slaughter. You're not going to go with a shochet knife and sever its trachea and jugular in the same, okay, you get the point. So resolving ambiguity seems to be the agenda of the book of Leviticus. And that, I think, is why all of this mess stuff is threatening or challenging to the rabbinic mind. The rabbis, taking their cue from Leviticus, want to resolve ambiguity so that they can present life in clean, neat, organized, logical categories, the building blocks of Jewish life. If something is a whatchamacallit, if something is a doohickey, if something is a thingamabob and doesn't have a defined identity, the rabbis have to find a way to define its identity. And they're not making this up out of whole cloth. The Torah gives them their template. The book of Leviticus specifically, which speaks in the language of pure and impure, clean and unclean. But again, it's not about your schmutz or are you pristine. It's a ritual state. It's an artificial assignment of a ritual state based on certain objective or maybe subjective criteria. What is a ruminant? A ruminant, somebody asked, is an animal that chews its cud and that digests its diet through a chambered stomach in various stages. So certain animals, goats, sheep, cattle, all cattle are ruminants, but a number of land mammals are not. A squirrel, for instance, has neither a ruminant stomach nor cloven hooves. It is not kosher. A rabbit, although delicious, does not have a ruminant stomach. It does not have cloven hooves. It's not kosher. A chicken, it's not a land mammal. Different rules. Okay. Chicken might not be meat, somebody writes. Yes, it might not be. And the only reason that chicken is treated as meat and needs to be slaughtered in a certain way is actually all about appearances. When you put it on your table and you've skinned it from the bone and you have your nice breast meat just sitting out there without any resemblance of an actual chicken at that point, somebody at the next table could look over and think you have a pile of actual meat and not fowl. Fowl should be treated differently from basar or meat in the rabbinic mind, but it's not. The reason that we treat birds and the meat of birds the same way we treat the meat of ruminants with cloven hoofs is largely an issue of optics and creating an extra fence of protection. Somebody hilariously wrote in the chat box, Joanne, I think I'll be a vegetarian now. Yeah, this is great. This has been my objective today, starting with challah and working our way through semen, feces, and okay, let's move on. Are pure and impure or holy and profane interchangeable depending on the perception or understanding of the event or situation? Yeah, I would say yes, but of course an Orthodox rabbi would say no. These are defined categories, and the whole point of the Mishnah is to give you clear, easily identifiable, hard and fast criteria by which you can tell whether something is X or Y, pure or not pure, holy, profane. But of course, I approach Judaism both as an insider to the tradition and also as a critic of the tradition. And I mean critic not in the sense of disparagement, but rather I look at this tradition critically through the disciplines of history and science, anthropology, sociology, literary criticism, all of these things that are external to the phenomenon of Judaism itself that an insider would bring. So I think that I can objectively say to you, John Freiberg, who asked this question, it is both yes and no. From the inside looking out as a Jew, these terms are absolute and the norms around them are intended to provide clear, direct guidance for identifying what is A and what is not A, what is pure, what is impure. From the outside looking in, I would assign to this entire enterprise a high degree of subjectivity. Okay, let's read one more Mishnah. And then we're going to complete chapter 3. Hooray, we did so well today. Well, now we're talking about a zav. And what is a zav? Well, a zav is identified in the book of Leviticus, chapter 15, verse 16, as a person who has an abnormal seminal emission. So now we're talking about somebody, and I don't know exactly what that means. Doesn't mean a person who has, for instance, a venereal disease, of which there would be certain kinds of discharge that could be identified as that's not normal. Or maybe he has a urological problem and there's blood that is visible. Again, the rabbis don't like these situations that don't resemble the norms they have set up so that you can have your building blocks, your nice, neat categories. But we have to talk about them because they were familiar with cases that defy the norm. This is, by the way, this is medicine, right? This is what the whole act of the science of diagnosis is all about, figuring out, what's this person got? What are the signs I can use as a doctor or as a diagnostician to identify what my patient is dealing with? And sometimes they're very clear, a skin lesion or a mole that has very clearly identifiable presenting symptoms. And sometimes they're just not. And my dad told me that there's a medical term known as the FLK, the funny looking kid. It's not intended to disparage, it's intended to identify. We know that something's wrong medically with this person, with this human being, this child. It's just that we don't have any exact defining science to present, to provide an absolute diagnosis of what's going on. Do I have that more or less right, Dad?
Yeah, the pejorative of funny looking, notwithstanding, it really means a syndrome that's not easily identifiable. There are many syndromes that cross the line and are ambiguous.
Right. And so, and of course, the rabbis are working in an environment without the benefits of scientific method. They're not scientists. However, they are diagnosticians. They're using the tools at their disposal, which are largely the ones that are provided from the Torah, specifically the book of Leviticus, to do their diagnoses. So a Zav is a rabbinic, he's a character, I wouldn't just say in the rabbinic imagination, it's a character in the rabbinic experience. He's a real kind of person who has an abnormal seminal emission. And then you have a nida. A nida is a woman experiencing menstruation, from whom semen escapes. So this is a problem, right? Because when you're menstruating, you're not supposed to be having sex. So what do you do if you are emitting both menstrual blood and semen? Uh-oh, we've got a rabbinic problem here, right? Because this person cannot be put into a neat category. Following? All I'm pointing out is why these characters are problematic for the rabbis. And that's why, we've been talking about exceptions to the rule. Nominally, this is all supposed to be about when do you say the Shema. I have to keep reminding us, we're talking about when you can and cannot, must and must not say the Shema. We're really deep into the detailed work of who is exempt and who is obligated. So we're now in the exception to the exception to the exception. You've got abnormal seminal emission or abnormal presentation of menstruation where it is mixed with semen, and a woman who becomes nida during intercourse. So let's say you're having sex and your period comes. Uh-oh, we got a problem because you're not supposed to be having sex, but now it's too late. All the rabbis want to say is there's an easy way to get around this. Just go to the mikveh and you'll be back in the ritually acceptable state. Now, if you have a venereal disease, going to the mikveh is probably not going to cure you. But that's not how the rabbis are thinking about this. That's why I really teach students of all ages, kids especially, or teenagers especially, not to interpret our religious tradition as declaring that sex is dirty. It's not. Sex can be holy or it can be unholy, and often it's like something in between, because sex is messy, because life is messy. But the endeavor here of Rabbinic Judaism is to take the mess and to unmessify it, clean it up a little bit, make it at least understandable. So in this case of these really complicated scenarios of a seminal emission that doesn't come out right, or that looks funny, or that feels wrong, or I think the more relatable scenario of a woman who experiences both menstruation and sexual intercourse with ejaculation from the male at the same time, just go to the mikveh. And interestingly enough, Rabbi Judah exempts them, which is he exempting them from going to the mikveh, or is he exempting them from saying the Shema? And I believe that the answer to this one is that Rabbi Judah is basically saying that since the immersion is not actually going to make you pure, there's no reason for you to immerse. So the exemption that is being raised by Rabbi Judah is not about saying the Shema. We're on the inner subject, right? If we've got this enclosing subject about reciting the Shema with its exemptions and obligations, the inner subject, the innermost circle, is about specifically what do you do in the case of mixed and mingled sex and menstruation, ejaculation that is abnormal. All of these cases, there's again a split opinion between the rabbis. The main rabbinic community says, just go to the mikveh. Rabbi Judah and he's often the dissenting voice here. We've seen that in previous Mishnayot, Rabbi Judah says, it's not actually going to fix anything, so just get on with your life. And they don't have doctors, they don't have fertility doctors, they don't have sexual health medical professionals. So you got to work in a world that's 2,000 years removed from our own. That takes us to the end of chapter 3, perhaps not where you expected to go when I told you we'd be studying the Shema and its exemptions today. But I'm open for the next 2 or 3 minutes to your thoughts, comments, questions. I'm hoping that we, at the very least, we might be able to use this last couple of minutes to clear our nausea. No lunch for me. Yep, I see you in the chat window, Beth. I get it. I'm teaching on an empty stomach today. It's much better. Okay, my friends. As always, I consider it a very rich and rewarding privilege to study with you. I consider myself a student alongside you, teaching this material. This is really my first systematic immersion in Mishna. I almost said in the mikveh. In the mikveh of the Mishna, the purifying waters of the Mishna, which is my artful and ham-fisted way of claiming a word bobble. Just so grateful. Another comment from Russell. Did those rabbis have nothing better to do? I think the answer to your question, Russell, is yes. These rabbis had nothing better to do. Literally, this is the best thing that these rabbis deemed that they could do with their time, is contribute to Jewish life in every jot and tittle. And by the way, once you study Mishnah, once you all become Ba'alei Mishnah, masters of Mishnah, you will understand the fundamentals of everything about Jewish life. So go have a wonderful day, go have some lunch and restore your appetites, and I look forward to seeing you next Thursday, 10:15, same bat time, same bat channel. In the interim, join us tomorrow evening for Shabbat services at 6:15. Our Darshan, delivering the Devar Torah, will be a familiar face and friend of Westchester Reform Temple, Omer Nisanov, who was our shlicha, our wonderful youth emissary for 2 years. She now resides in Tel Aviv and is in a graduate study program in Herzliya and also works for a startup. She also had a real battle with COVID-19 this spring, was hospitalized in Tel Aviv, quarantined in a hospital for over a month, and has an extraordinary story to tell about how Israel has responded to the pandemic, both the good and the not so good. She's going to be a really interesting speaker, so please, please, please tune in tomorrow evening. If you don't know Omer, as Joanne wrote in the chat box, she's just awesome. She's 26 years old. She's a total dynamo. She was one of the elite emissaries selected by the Jewish Agency to interface with an American Jewish community here at WRT for 2 years. I'm so excited to reconnect with her and to have her hold forth with us tomorrow evening. So I'll wish you an early Shabbat Shalom and even more a Chodesh Tov, a beautiful and blessed month of Elul. See you soon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Kol hakavod, Rabbi.
Toda rabah, Dad.
Thank you.
Bye, guys. Bye, everyone.